Roberta Winters, past president and member of the League of Women Voters of Radnor Township. The League has advocated relentlessly for decades to develop a fair, transparent, and impartial process for drawing mapping of our states through things like people-powered fair maps and Fair Districts PA. Today we're talking about redistricting again, but this time not about congressional or state maps. We're talking about local redistricting. Now, to help us understand local redistricting and why it matters, I've invited two guests. Some of you may recognize them. We're fortunate to have with us today Jamie Mogil and Amanda Holt. Jamie and Amanda, thank you for being here today. We are so lucky to have your expertise to guide us in this important discussion. But before we begin, can you tell our audience a little bit about yourselves?
I'll start. Thanks, Roberta. I'm an attorney with my own firm specializing in small businesses as they grow. I've been fortunate enough to be PA Election Protection Director with groups like Common Cause, and I work with Fair Districts PA. And I've been fortunate to work and be on the state board of the League of Women Voters, where I was fortunate enough also to work on Act 77, the first election reforms in over 80 years in Pennsylvania that brought us no excuse vote by mail. And I'm currently president of our local league, the Lower Merion and Narberth League, and we are working on this issue right now that we'll be talking about today, which is local redistricting, because at its core, and we'll be hearing more from Amanda, who's one of my heroes, is to talk about fairness and representation.
And my redistricting journey began back in 2010 when I was interested in how I was being represented in elections, and eventually led me to historic victory before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And since then, I've served as an expert witness on redistricting before legislative committees and the Legislative Reapportionment Commission. I was honored to serve on the Governor's Pennsylvania Redistricting Reform Commission. I just continue to be very passionate about how we are represented and how districts impact our representation. It really mattered when our country was founded, and I think it really still matters today.
Well, thank you again. We are really lucky to have you with us so we can learn about this important topic. So let's start with the big picture. Just what is local redistricting?
Well, thanks, Roberta, because I think this issue, maybe now through Amanda and others like Fair Districts, myself, and the League, Fair Districts is a project of the League of Women Voters, but through that advocacy, I think people are more aware of what redistricting is, maybe though in the context of state and congressional mapping, as you noted, and maybe not with regards to local redistricting. So the broader view is, with that familiarity, is that every 10 years, this decennial process begins after the federal census, and district lines must be adjusted, to account and to assure representation in each of those districts. And it's really about approximation. We're not talking about having everything as, completely equal, but as near as equal as possible in the number of residents within those districts. So this process, that redrawing of election district boundaries, that's known as redistricting. But local redistricting, what is that? And we'll be talking more about it, is really what comes down to our townships. So Radnor, Lower Merion, even school districts, cities like Philadelphia have already done their redistricting, and people may be more familiar with wards. So Lower Merion, we have 14 wards. Radnor we'll be talking about, and those are those district boundaries. And so the same process should begin after that, and each government body, so whether it's the Board of Commissioners or a city council, they're tasked with drawing those election boundaries.
Amanda, I know you've had a lot of experience with this. So can you perhaps give us some examples and tell us a little bit more so we can understand it better?
Sure. Here are the ward boundaries for Aston Township from 10 years ago. And as Jamie noted, each one is supposed to have approximately the same number of people living in it so that they have equal representation. But over the course of 10 years, of course, population is changing in the different districts. And so today, the difference between the largest and smallest district, what they call the overall range, has grown to be 63%. And so courts don't consider an overall range like that to still be equal. And that's why boundaries like those in Aston Township will need to be adjusted. But then there are other areas like Darby Borough, for example, where their population hasn't changed as much over the last 10 years. And so their boundary lines won't need to be adjusted because they're still approximately equal. So many townships and boroughs, and most of them, will find that they actually do need to make some kind of adjustment. It's because there can be zoning changes that happen, or maybe development in the township or area, and that means their population changes significantly in some areas, but maybe not as much in others. And so they will need to adjust their ward boundaries to maintain that equality. And so here are some other examples from Delaware County. There's Haverford, who has a 17% variance, Middletown at a 12% variance, Nether Providence at an 18% variance, Radnor at a 32% variance, Ridley at a 49% variance, Upper Darby at a 14% variance, and Upper Providence at a 31% variance.
I think townships and boroughs in Delaware County have a lot of work to do. I know we have an election coming up soon for local and municipal offices. So what are we going to do with this timeline, Jamie? What is it?
Well, the timeline, similarly to what's set out for the redistricting of that decennial process, really comes down to what the code and even what could be in the local charter or part of the communities. They might have their own set of rules, but it's pretty straightforward that it's a year after the results are released. So we do know that that is the end of this year. Since the results were released last year, we did have a bit of delay with the census, and then you can we'll talk about this, right? But, what's happening in your community, most people, unfortunately, even local governments may not even know to do this. So advocates, the leagues, the civic organizations, we recommend, contacting your local government, getting in touch with them, finding out what they say as far as this, what are you doing to draw the maps? And what are you doing to, and most importantly, include the public in this process. We're going to hear about some good examples, but there's also other communities that unfortunately it becomes an inside game of drawing these maps. And of course, we know about gerrymandering, where the very people we're voting on, that they're choosing us. And unfortunately, that happens even at the local level.
So we know there's a timeline and it's coming up and the deadline is soon. So people need to get active. And we've seen, as Amanda has shown us, that there are variances all over the place, and they need to be, the ward lines need to be redrawn to reflect those population changes. But just what factors or guidelines should local governments consider when drawing those maps? Are they set out someplace so that people know what they're supposed to do?
That's set out in the law. It's similar to what we've already been talking about, near equal population, and this has been litigated. So of course you want to be compact and contiguous. And I do warn people, Pennsylvania has some weird lines, that we have weird streets and rivers and creeks. So it may not look like it's contiguous, but maybe take a look closer. And then of course, while you can't always get near or equal population, you want to make sure that you're keeping communities and neighborhoods together. And so I'll leave it to Amanda, because she's been a consultant. She can give us like a case example or something more specific.
Sure, because it's important when you're doing this that you're also looking at something that a lot of times you don't even realize that are there, which is called census blocks. That's something that no one really knows about. They're something you don't really pay attention till you get involved with local redistricting, because it is something that becomes much more significant. So these census blocks are the smallest geographic area that the Census Bureau uses to count people. And they are something that might just include a few houses or maybe a city block. So they can be very, very small. Some don't even have any people living in them. And then here are all the census blocks in Radnor Township. And these census block lines can't be changed when you're drawing your local redistricting. They have to follow these boundaries of the census blocks. And so when the ward and region lines are being drawn, map drawers are grouping these census blocks together into wards and regions. You can look no further than right here in Radnor Township and follow their wonderful example, because they created a process that provided transparency about how their ward lines are being drawn. They held meetings, public meetings about setting goals, reviewing map proposals, and even hearing from the public and getting feedback from the public about how things were going. And Radnor Township wouldn't have the process that they have today without the advocacy of concerned citizens, like those who belong to the League of Women Voters here in Radnor Township. In 2013, there was a charter amendment that they supported, which passed, that outlined goals for redistricting and really established a process that needed to be followed that has been helpful in future redistricting cycles.
I know it's been a long journey, and I also would like to note that sometimes I get complaints from people who live in Radnor that the people across the street from them have a whole different set of people, of candidates actually, that they'll be voting for. So Jamie may live on one side of the street, I'm on the other. I have these 3 candidates to vote for, and she has 3 different ones. How does that happen?
That's really coming down to how the wards are drawn. So if I live in one voting precinct and those lines are drawn, and then the precincts, so just to be clear for everybody, precincts and election districts can kind of go hand in hand sometimes, but an election district would be those wards that the local government is drawing. Election district comes from the code and is maybe more legalese and what's set out. So we sometimes use them interchangeably, but what people are most familiar with is their polling location. I always get asked, well, are you going to change my polling location? But the voting precinct, that's that polling location. And so you may have several precincts that are there within one polling location. But that comes down again to how they draw the lines, whether it's the school district, the township, if you're in a township, or maybe you're in a borough that also has, some seats that are at large, but are also some districts. It's a strange but also interesting world in the Commonwealth. We have thousands of municipalities, but these voting precincts are really what comes down to the building blocks that are within these election districts.
Yeah, for example, the state house district lines here in Radnor back in 2012, you can see the boundary between the 2 house districts looks a little jagged. And the reason it was that way was because of the voting precinct boundary. So this voting precinct the boundary of it was following roadways that clearly do not go in a straight line. And so because of that, it created this jagged boundary that when the house districts were drawn, they used to create a division in the township. And so keeping neighborhoods in the same voting precinct really helps protect a community when even other redistricting maps are being drawn.
And just to be clear, I just want to say those maps were redrawn thanks to the advocacy of the League in Radnor and your help and the Board of Commissioners prior to this recent redistricting that happened for the state and congressional maps, correct? Because I know I'm in an area, I just want to point this out, that we're still divided. Our township has has close to 64,000 people. We're still divided. Congressional district, very strange lines that cut and splice and dice us. So I've told, and it's really important that we encourage people when they hear redistricting, or as you said, this may go over their head, it really is about keeping a community together in neighborhoods and not having that confusion of, well, why is the person across the street? I mean, maybe it may be Montgomery Avenue, Lancaster Avenue, which are more considered of the, these main areas or highways. That would make sense. But a block in a neighborhood with, a community, if they're in a development, that wouldn't make sense. So I just wanted to point that out, because Radnor, best case scenario, but also unfortunately an anomaly right now.
When you look at all of this, Amanda, what are we looking at in terms of factors to say, well, this is fair or this isn't fair?
Yeah. Well, one of the first tests of fairness is population equality, because the law requires districts be as equal as practicable because they want you to have equal representation. So when deciding what is equal, the courts commonly look at what we've talked about before, this overall range, which is the difference between the largest and smallest district, and they don't want that to be more than 10%. But equality is just one factor and really just a starting point in the process, because fairness can mean different things to different people. So it's really important to, at the beginning, have a conversation, really talk as a community about what matters to you, what makes sense for your area, and where the line should go and what factors should be considered in drawing lines that will best represent your community.
And I know, Jamie, you mentioned that as well, because we have districts we have little areas in each of our townships where we have people who may be disenfranchised when the wards are drawn in certain ways.
Right, and it goes back to this idea of fairness linking with representation, that if you have a large deviation that overpopulates a certain area, you want to consider, okay, that means that will they have the same or fair representation, and also is about making the job easier for those who are running for office. Certainly, if you keep a community together and you have fair representation as near to equal population in a neighborhood and a community kept together, that you get closer to this idea of representative democracy that really is the bedrock of our Constitution and our country. And keeping these neighborhoods together. Some school districts, I do not live in a school district where it's set up by districts, but some do. So we have at-large seats, but state house, it goes on and on from a local level all the way up. And this idea of representations comes down to a fair plan for those particular wards.
I've heard something about this Dave's Redistricting app. And I know Jamie happens to be a fan of it. To me, it just goes right over my head. Amanda knows it like the back of her hand. But how can Dave's Redistricting app help local communities in this process?
It transforms the way, you don't need to be a mapper, and much props to all of the planners that are working in the townships or the counties or statewide, but because they know like GSI and they can get very close and into all the nitty gritty. But this opened the process and really transformed citizen participation in drawing maps. Now, I of course still am one of those people that I like to look at everything and print everything out and sketch it out. But Dave's Redistricting app, you can actually go online and review the maps that are there for your particular area. You can actually paint, as they call it, which is setting out the districts for your particular area. So in Lower Merion, I created a map. I've created many of them, but I can also look at the maps that are proposed. So Radnor, for instance, you can go on and see the options that were evaluated. You can create your own maps. I have 14 wards in my town township, so I knew the population and so forth. And it's an incredible tool to really evaluate. You can also see minority population and the factors that are so important, that if you could have a majority minority ward or district, that is so critical also in considering those weighted factors in addition to equal population and compact and contiguous. So highly recommended. We are going to do a separate little video on how to use that because we don't have a lot of time just to talk about that. But I do recommend people use that, as well as the census website is fantastic for that kind of information.
So, what happens now, Amanda, after Radnor Township or Lower Merion has devised these maps and they've been approved by their local government authorities? What happens next? How are these precincts and polling places and things like that? Who figures out how they're located?
The County Bureau of Elections gets involved, so they are looking at what the new precinct boundaries should be, so they're making proposals for those and showing how they should maybe be realigned. They have to get approval from the Court of Common Pleas in their county, as well as the Department of State. They also need to hold public hearings on the proposed new precinct boundaries, and they are letting the voters know about where they're going to be at, and they're going to also propose where those new polling places that we care about so much and are so familiar with are going to be. So those are all things that they are taking care of when they're doing this, and they can, and the local governing board can also be someone who makes recommendations and has some input into the process and can be involved in determining where those lines will be.
I'm glad Radnor is on the right track, but what about those thousands of other municipalities in Pennsylvania that don't have a process delineated that's transparent and will provide for public input? What about those municipalities that don't even have wards or districts in them, like boroughs? You know, what's going on?
It starts just like this. It starts with having a conversation, maybe even learning what local redistricting is, maybe telling people to tune in. This will be available. There's certainly the opportunity to make sure that you speak to your township or the relevant local government, especially the township staff. If they have a manager, that's definitely somebody you should speak to, and then let them know what's happening in Radnor. Radnor is the best case scenario. It's what the league, we continue to advocate for, which is this fair, impartial, and transparent process with public input. And you know, this idea of just looking at the maps yourself. I know it may seem, you say that it's over your head, which I really don't doubt. You're a smart lady. You went to Harvard. But I really want to note that look at your neighborhood. Look at the lines. You will recognize if something is off. Like there's just a line going down your development that you live in. Those are the things that I tell people to look at and utilize your voice. Find your civic, find the league in your area, and we're more than happy to connect and give you that platform.
Yeah, I mean, it takes really common sense. I mean, don't be overwhelmed by everything that you've heard today. It really takes common sense. You yourself can see what makes sense in your community because no one knows it better than you. You live there, you're the one that works there, you're driving around there, and you know what would make sense for your area. And so your voice does matter, and you have the power to speak up and make a difference.
And Amanda has been doing that for more than a decade, so we are more than grateful to have you here, Amanda, and Jamie, for your expertise as well. We want to thank you for helping our audience learn so much more about this critical issue that requires immediate action and your attention. If you want to make sure that you and others in your community are fairly represented, it's important for you to get to work right now. Don't wait. Drawing lines within your municipality is fundamental to district and congressional lines. It prevents disenfranchisement to help and assure that every elected official listens to every voter at the local and hence state and national level. To find out more about this issue and others, join the League of Women Voters. You can do it right here in Radnor or most places throughout the Commonwealth. We continue to appreciate the public service provided by Mainline Television Network that helps bring to your attention important topics of civic engagement such as this. We are grateful also to you, our audience, for watching and learning with us as the League continues to provide efforts that promote good government and accountability. Thank you for listening, for together we can help make democracy work. It's time to get into action. Thank you.